Well, thank you for the invitation to speak to you a second time here at the seminary on the Synod of Dordt. This is a topic that I've been working at, well, off and on, ever since 1981, I think, when I started working on my doctoral dissertation, which dealt with the Synod of Dordt. And at that time, it was one of the few dissertations or works to deal with the actual manuscripts of the Synod. I don't think anybody for 50 years had done any work with the manuscripts until I did. Now, since then, a number of people have gotten into it, especially, of course, in relationship to the 400th anniversary of 2018 and 2019. And that produced, I don't know, 6, 7, 8 books about the Synod, one of which came from your own seminary here. Anyway, ever since I retired from teaching at Trinity Christian in 2012, I've been working on the Synod of Dordt basically nonstop, working on several projects. The main one being the 2 volumes standing there, the Acta Documenta of the Synod of Dordt. It's a collection of all the documents of the Synod of Dordt in all original languages in 10 volumes. And we've published 3 volumes. I'm working on the 4th one right now. I'm one of 3 general editors, and we have about 50 people, mostly Europeans, working on individual documents. So it's an international project to get all these documents out. And it's taking longer than I expected. Initially, we started this in 2009, which was the anniversary of Calvin's birth, right? At a conference in Dordrecht, it was. We were talking about the Calvin year, but then somebody raised the question, in 10 years, the Synod of Dordt will be 400 years anniversary. What are we going to do about that? So that began the idea to publish all the documents of the Synod. And at that time, in 2010, I went to the Netherlands and drew up an inventory of all the documents I could find at that point. I found many more since then, but an initial inventory and a prospectus for this big series. And I thought, well, 10 years, we can get that done by the anniversary year. Well, by the anniversary year, I think we had 2 of the volumes done. It just takes a lot more work, especially when you don't have a big pile of money to work with and, gather scholars in one place to concentrate on it. These are basically scholars who are busy at their own teaching or whatever, and you ask them to volunteer their time to work on this document or that document. And when you have so many scholars, as general editors, it's a lot of work just to keep that whole herd moving in one direction. But it's going, it's progressing. We'll have 2 more volumes out, I'm hoping by next year. Not volumes that I'm working on. I'm working on a volume dealing with the canons and the early drafts and early documents of the canons. And that'll probably take me a couple of years just to get that volume out with a number of other people helping me, of course. Anyway, that gives you a sense of the kinds of things I've been working on. Oh, I should mention that I'm also involved, just as an editor, of the Acta Authentica, which I talked about last week, and I took along a copy here. This is probably the only copy in the world outside of the original one in Utrecht. So I had this made, photocopy of course, but this is being translated, the original Acta, being translated into English by Joseph Tipton, a classical scholar in North Carolina. And I'm working with him as an editor on that. So that takes up some of my time. And I was just talking in the lunchroom there with some of the students about a collection of articles that I've written over about the Synod of Dordt. That's being published by Reformation Heritage Books, and we're about done with that collection. In fact, just yesterday I got the last version of it, and all I have to do is write up the indices yet, which is kind of a big job, but that'll come out later this year. And then one other topic, my dissertation was never formally published, and so I've been revising that and hope to get that out in the next couple of years. So all of those together mean that all of my time is taken up with the Synod of Dordt. So this particular topic, which you asked me to speak on, the church order of Dordt in historical perspective. This is one of the articles of that collection that will come out later this year. So I worked up this article in final form about a year ago. This is the first time I'm actually presenting it. So let's get into the topic. Besides the canons of Dordt, the most important and long-lasting contribution of the Synod of Dordt was the Church Order of Dordt. The Synod dealt with the church order, with its church order matters in its final sessions. So let's first look at the formation of, or background of the Church Order of Dordt. The Church Order of Dordt was not a new church order, but a revision of the 1586 Church Order of the Synod of The Hague, which was the last national synod to be held more than 30 years earlier. However, the formation of the Church Order of Dordt has direct roots that go back even further to the National Synod of Emden of 1571, which is known as the first National Synod of the Dutch Reformed Churches. Church polity in the Netherlands was also shaped by even earlier church orders that were drawn up in the broader Reformed tradition in countries that had Reformed populations, as well as in Reformed refugee communities. The church orders introduced by Calvin in his Reform program upon his return to Geneva, the ecclesiastical ordinances of 1541, and those were revised in 1561, they laid part of the foundation for Reformed church polity. These ordinances for the city of Geneva prescribed 4 ecclesiastical offices: minister, doctor or teacher, elder, and deacon, as well as the consistory. This is the first time the consistory appeared as a body of ministers and elders overseeing the local church. The classis, or regional body of churches, was first introduced by the Synod of Lausanne in 1537. Now, other early church orders that contributed to the Reformed polity included Johannes Olasco's Forma ac Ratio of 1555, which recorded the rights of the Strangers' Church of London, the refugee church, Dutch refugee church in London. The next one in this series, the French Reformed Ecclesiastical Discipline of 1559, implemented 4 levels of church assembly: the local consistory, the regional colloquy or classis, the provincial synod, and the general synod or national synod. Now you have to keep in mind, in the Netherlands and broader in Europe, when you talk about synods, there's usually 2 levels: the provincial level, provincial synods, and the national synod. Also, the Palatinate Church Order of 1563, which came out about the time of the Heidelberg Catechism. Also contributing were the decisions of the early Reformed synods in the southern Low Countries, especially in Antwerp, from 1563 to 1566. These followed the example of the French Reformed churches. Now, recent research has shown that the so-called Convent of Wesel, 1568, which we probably all learned was one of those in that series of Dutch Reformed synods, and it's kind of the first one. But this recent research has shown that this was not an actual event or ecclesiastical assembly, but rather just a proposal for the future organization of the Dutch Reformed churches drawn up by Peter de Thanes. Simeon Reitinck considered Wesel to be the first of a series of 6 Dutch Reformed national synods from 1568 to 1618. I've given you the name of the scholar there, Spanholz, who did this research. I've got his book on the table as well. Now, the first National Synod of the Dutch churches was actually the Synod of Emden of 1571. Its church polity was modeled on the 1559 French ecclesiastical discipline, and though it was conducted in exile in Emden, the Synod of Emden laid the foundation for the polity of the Dutch Reformed churches. The first article of Emden's Acts presented the anti-hierarchical basis for Reformed church polity. In other words, no church or minister or elder or deacon should have authority over others. Now, at Emden, the first regulations for church order in the Dutch churches was established. And in the following synods, they were confirmed and expanded and revised. Thus, the church polity decisions of this 1571 synod were the first in a direct line of church order decisions of a series of synods, which included, and I've got them all listed here, first of all, or second then, would be the Provincial Synod of Dordrecht, 1574. Now, both 1571 and 1574, neither of them had actual church orders, formal church orders, but their decisions dealt with church polity, and it's the synodical decisions then that are considered to be of church order significance. Then the National Synod of Dordrecht, 1578, was the synod that produced the first formal church order. Next one, the National Synod of Middelburg, 1581, produced the Church Order of Middelburg. And then finally, the National Synod of The Hague, 1586, produced the Church Order of The Hague. And then it was more than 30 years before the next synod, which was, of course, the Synod of Dordt of 1618-19. Now, this is the foundation on which the Church Order of Dordt was built. Since the, I'm not keeping up here. I'm toward the end of that. Since the Synod of Emden, 1571, met outside the Netherlands in exile, Dutch state authorities had no influence upon this synod. So that's important to recognize, this relationship between church and state, which I'll take you through as I continue here, but it starts out, of course, a church in exile is running away from the state, so you don't have any Dutch state influence at that time. But in 1573, only 2 years later, the States of Holland, that's the province of Holland. Now remember that the political body of each province was called states. So when I say States of Holland, that refers to the political body that runs the province of Holland. And States General is the broader Dutch government that is over the whole of the Netherlands. So, 1573, the States of Holland took charge of church property as well as minister salaries. So you can see immediately they're getting into church affairs. Although the church wanted to maintain independence from the state, early influence of the state in church order matters appeared in this Synod of Dordrecht, 1574, which requested support and cooperation of the local magistrate in matters such as hiring and dismissal of teachers, poor relief, forbidding of Sunday desecration, marriage, and divorce. So the initiative came from that synod, come and help us on these things. Such state influence only increased in later synods. For example, in the Middelburg 1581 Middelburg 1581 church order, the States General was allowed to have representatives at the classis meeting that was preparing for the next National Synod in order to participate in those deliberations. This legitimized the influence of the States General on the calling of national synods. So halfway through this process, the churches themselves, even though they wanted to call national synods, they couldn't because they needed the States General to call the synods and help pay for the costs, of course. Now, within a few years, the States General fully controlled the convening of national synods, which led to a situation where, despite the calls by the churches to hold a national synod every 3 years, that was in those church orders, the States General, for various reasons, refused to convene a national synod for 32 years after the 1586 Synod of The Hague. Now, while the church orders of the earlier national synods were operative in parts of the Netherlands, these church orders were not politically approved by the States General or by the states of any of the provinces. The provinces sought more influence in church affairs, especially in the calling of ministers, where the provinces claimed the right of patronage. So, in cases of Holland, Utrecht, Zeeland, and Groningen, the provinces drew up their own provincial church orders or political church orders. And on this list that I've got here, anything in blue is one of those political church orders drawn up by the provinces and not drawn up by the church. So you see the list there, Holland and Zeeland, and then Holland, Utrecht, Holland laws, Zeeland, and then Groningen has 2 church orders, one for the city, Stad Groningen, and the other for the Ommelanden, in other words, the rural district outside of the city. So they had 2 church orders, and then Utrecht church laws. So there's that big gap between all of those church orders and the Synod of Dordt. And of course, within that gap is the Arminian controversy, which throws everything in the air. Now in 1612, a collection of the ecclesiastical church orders as well as the political church orders was published. And I've listed there the church orders that are included in this collection. Now, with a variety of church orders being observed in various parts of the Netherlands, there was a strong desire at the Synod of Dordt in 1619 to provide a single church order that would be approved by the States General, with the goal that it be uniformly observed in all churches of the country. So you can see that there's a lot of desire by the Synod of Dordt, let's all have one church order rather than this whole list that I've gone through there, and it varies from province to province. So it's quite a complicated affair with church and state church orders. Okay, moving on to the Synod of Dordt's own deliberations on church order. The secret instructions that were drafted by the States General for its state delegates at the Synod specified that the church order matters should be transacted only by Dutch delegates in the absence of the foreign delegates. So that's the reason why the Synod of Dordt dealt with church order matters way at the end in the so-called post-acta sessions of May 1619, after the foreign delegates had gone home. Church order issues were treated in 10 sessions, 10 of those sessions. The specific points that were handled arose from gravamina or overtures that had been submitted by the provincial synods. The first of the post-acta sessions, session 155, it was reported that the state delegates had agreed that the regulations of the church order of the last synod of The Hague, 1586, should be examined. So in that session, that 1586 church order was then publicly read in the synod. Next session, 156, the articles of the 1586 church order were approved in substance. This was kind of a preliminary step. They're not approving totally, but they're approving it in substance. And there was no uniform church order in the provinces, so there was a desire at least to seek some sort of unanimity of all the delegations on the basis of that 1586 church order. So, but it was expected that the Synod of Dordt would update and make any necessary revisions to this 1586 church order. So that 1586 church order is the foundation then for the Church Order of Dordt. In the same session, the Synod decided to petition the States General to approve these church order articles so that they might have the authority of public laws in the Dutch churches throughout the country. The first issue to be addressed was the calling of ministers. And in this connection, a debate took place about whether the right of patronage should be done away with or at least be restricted so that the churches would not be harmed. Now, this right of patronage was a long-standing right of nobility and large landowners to appoint ministers in their own lands. So you have to picture this as kind of a feudal situation yet, or left over from the feudal system, these large landowners who control these large areas, and there's a church or two in their territory, and they have the right to appoint a minister for the church in their territory. That's the right of patronage. And this right had deep historical roots, especially in the provinces of northern provinces of Groningen and Friesland, and Drenthe as well. The South Holland delegation complained of difficulties with the right of patronage and wanted that whole right to be abolished. On the other hand, the Drenthe delegation requested that the right of patronage should remain untouched. So you've got radically different viewpoints there at the Synod. The state delegates informed the Synod that the States General would never allow this right to be done away with. And therefore the Synod should only not try to abolish this right, but only try to prevent the abuses. In the next session, 157, the advice of the various delegations was read, and the sentiment was expressed that the right of patronage was contrary to God's word. However, the discussion focused on the proper limits of patronage in such a way that the Synod reached a compromise. The right of patronage was left to the patrons, but its use would be restricted so that any abuses would be prevented. For this purpose, the Synod decided to deliver a list of 9 articles to the States General with a request that they recommend these to the provinces. Among these 9 articles, the main points were that the only right allowed to the patron was restricted to the right to nominate an acceptable person to serve as minister, that the patrons provide adequate support to the minister, that patrons propose only such persons who are sound in doctrine, of good behavior, and adorned with gifts for ministry, that the church has a right to reject that person, and that classis examine the proposed person and install him into the ministry. And finally, that the patron does not have the right to dismiss the minister. Now, the Synod also added the right of patronage to Article 5 of the Dordt Church Order, affirming that anyone's valid right of patronage will remain uncurtailed as long as it is used without detriment to the church. In session 158, 6 gravamina from the provincial synods, all of which related to church order, were presented and discussed. In the next one, session 159, each of the delegations gave their advice, and the Synod made decisions on each of these 6 points. So I'll just go down them, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. First, on church visitors. Each classis was to appoint some experienced ministers to visit all the churches, take note whether ministers, elders, and teachers faithfully performed their duties, adhered to sound doctrine, and followed church order, and promoted the edification of the church and the youth. This revised decision became Article 44 of Dordt's church order. 2, deputies of the provincial synod. Each provincial synod was to appoint some persons to carry out the decisions of the Synod in relationship to the government and to the classes, to preside over examinations of new ministers, to offer a helping hand to classes, and to give a report to the Synod. This decision became a new article in the Dordt Church Order, Article 49. 3. Correspondence between particular synods of each province. Each province was free to maintain correspondence with neighboring provincial synods. This decision became a new Article 48 of the Dordt Church Order. This article would be of great significance to maintain mutual cooperation between the various provincial synods, since there would be no national synod for over 200 years. Number 4, on the admission of the uneducated into the ministry, no one who has not followed the regular course of studies was to be admitted into the ministry unless they have exceptional gifts, godliness, discretion, and the gift of public speaking. The classes should first examine them and allow them to first exhort privately. And this again became a new Article 8 of the Dordt Church Order. Number 5, voting of ministers in classes where a church had more than one minister. Now that was pretty common, especially in the towns. You'd have one church with several ministers because of the population. So the question was, how can they function in classes? In these cases, they should be allowed to attend classes and have the right to vote. This became again a new Article 42 of the Dordt Church Order. And finally, 6, on preparing a suitable form of subscription to the Confession and Catechism, the Synod decided to prepare a specific form of subscription by which ministers should subscribe to the Confession, Catechism, and canons. This article actually did not change from the 1586 Church Order, but it did create a new form of subscription. In session 160, the Synod discussed policies to be observed in the calling of ministers. Now, the practice of calling ministers varied considerably from one province to the next, and initial drafts of the policy did not satisfy everyone. So in the next session, President Bogerman presented another draft which was adopted. According to this policy, the lawful calling of those who were entering the ministry consists first in the choice by consistory and deacons in consultation with the local magistrate and with the advice of classes. 2, in the examination into the doctrine of life conducted by the classes in the presence of deputies of the provincial synod. 3, approval by the local magistrate and also by the local congregation. 4, public installation in the congregation with the laying on of hands by the officiating minister. This revised decision became Article 4 of the Dordt Church Order. Now, concerning ministers who were already in the ministries but called to a different church, such calling should take place by consistory and deacons in consultation, again, with the magistrate and with the advice of classes. After approval by the magistrate and being presented to the congregation, they should be installed. If someone has a valid right of patronage, this should not be curtailed as long as it is exercised without detriment to the church and good church order. This revised decision became Article 5 of Dordt's order. Now, the stipulation about the right of patronage was an addition. It wasn't in previous church orders, but it's an addition to Article 5 of the Church Order of Dordt. it was also expected that those 9 articles that they had approved, which limited the right of patronage, should be added as an appendix to the church order, Articles 4 and 5. Now that was never done, but that was the intent. The changes to these 2 articles had the effect of increasing state influence in the calling of ministers, both by the approbation of the call by the magistrates and by requiring consultation with the magistrate in the choice of the minister. The requirement of consultation was added due to pressure from the state delegates. So here you see a case where those 18 state delegates representing the state general at the synod exercise some influence in the actual church order. Next, in the same session, the synod added a new article on the duty of the Christian magistrate. And it said that it's the duty of Christian government to promote worship services in every way, to extend a helping hand to ministers, elders, and deacons, and to protect them by their good order. So also all ministers, elders, and deacons are duty-bound to sincerely impress upon their whole congregation the obedience, love, and honor which they owe to magistrates. Such an article had not been part of any previous church order, but apparently this article was added as an attempt to curry favor with the States General in the hope that the States General would officially approve the Church Order of Dordt. Then in session 162, the Dutch delegations gave their advice on 6 more gravamina, 2 of which related to church order. The first led to 4 separate decisions. On religious holidays, congregations were instructed to observe Christmas, Easter, Pentecost, and the following day, and work toward observance of the days of Christ's circumcision, understood to be New Year's Day, and his ascension. This revised decision became Church Order 67. Second, then, on the use of hymns, only 150 psalms were to be sung in the services, along with a select group of hymns on the 10 Commandments, Lord's Prayer, Apostles' Creed, and the songs of Mary, Zacharias, and Simeon. This revised decision became Article 69 of the Dordt Church Order, and you can see the principle here was that only psalms and hymns that were found directly in the Bible were to be used in public worship services. 3, on forms of baptism of adults and children, ministers were instructed to use the existing forms for the administration of baptism. Again, a revised decision became Article 58. Next one, on adult baptism, it was declared that adults who are baptized are engrafted as members of the church, and therefore they are duty-bound to partake of the Lord's Supper. This became another new Article 59 in the Dordt Church Order. Now, in response to the next 6 gravamen on church discipline, the Synod declared that all churches should be earnestly exhorted to see that the articles of the church order on discipline were strictly observed. In session 163, the Synod dealt with another gravamen that relates to church order on admitting former priests to the ministry. And keep in mind, still Reformation period, still a lot of priests that had been in the Catholic Church now want to get into the Reformed Church. The Synod declared that newcomers, priests, monks, and those from the sects should not be admitted to the ministry except with great caution after they've first been tested for a while. This revised decision became Article 9. In the 175th session, the changes made to the church order were read and definitively approved. Now, at the same time, a small revision was made, which became Article 55 on the approval of books. Now, this is the extent of the revisions and additions that the Synod of Dordt, in its post-Acta sessions, made to the church order of 1586. So there were 8 revisions in all of the former articles, and I've listed the numbers there. And there were 6 new articles added to the church order. The result was the Church Order of Dordt with a total of 86 articles. Now on May 27, the Synod appointed a delegation to go to the States General. So this is just a day or two before the end of the Synod. And the Synod concluded, after the Synod concluded, to present a list of requests that the Synod wanted the States General to implement. This included the request that your high mightinesses approve and order that the church order, as revised and expanded in this Synod, might be uniformly maintained everywhere in the churches of these lands. On the 28th of May, the committee which was assigned to edit the Dordt Church Order completed its work. This committee also made 2 further revisions, including Dordt Church Order Article 20 on student exhorting, and again on Article 55 on the approval of books. The church order as revised then received the consent of the state delegates at the Synod, and on the 28th of May, the church order of Dordt was signed not by all delegates, but by the 5 officers of the Synod. And on May 30, the delegation that had been sent to the States General to present their list of requests presented that list, but as it turned out, the States General never did approve the Church Order of Dordt, nor did it order that the Church Order of Dordt be maintained in all the churches throughout the country. So that covers the deliberations at the Synod. Now let's move on to the structure and character of the Dordt Church Order. So the Church Order of Dordt followed the structure of the 1586 Church Order. After an introduction, Article 1, the Dordt Church Order consists of 4 sections: ecclesiastical offices, ecclesiastical assemblies, on doctrine, sacraments and other ceremonies, and on censure and ecclesiastical admonition. And that was followed by 3 concluding articles. The Church Order of Dordt exhibits an anti-hierarchical principle, which is especially evident in Article 84. No church shall in any way lord it over another church, no minister over other ministers, no elder or deacon over other elders or deacons. This anti-hierarchical article was found already in the Synod of Emden, 1571. The Church Order of Dordt embodies the presbyterial model of church polity. In other words, original church authority resides with the local church in the local consistory, which is made up of elders and ministers. And there are occasional gatherings of classes and synods that bring together the local churches in connection with one another. The provision made in the Dordt Church Order for correspondence between provincial synods allowed for a level of cooperation between these synods throughout the Netherlands. And also the other article, the provision for synodical deputies, provided for an avenue of interaction between the provincial synods. So these deputies were to take care of current church affairs until the next synod. They were to have contact with the classes and be involved in examining new ministers. Now this was very important since no national synod would be held in the Netherlands for the next 200 years. So thanks to those two articles, 48, 49, it allowed the interaction and kind of filled in the gap a bit since there was no national synod held for 200 years. The Dordt Church Order was the prototype of a Reformed church order, but it was not the ideal that the church wanted. There was too much state influence in internal church affairs. Now, on the whole, the Dordt Church Order in various articles gave the state greater role in church affairs than did the earlier church orders. Accommodations to the influence of the state in church affairs included an increased role of the state in the procedure to call ministers, and the local magistrate could exercise an influence in consistories by having its representatives present in the consistories, and especially in the matter of the right of patronage, the state delegates at the synod played a decisive role. The Church Order of Dordt was intended to be a dynamic set of regulations that could be changed as the needs and circumstances of the churches changed. So Article 6 specified that these articles are so formulated that if the benefit of the churches should require it, if the benefit of the churches should require it, they may and ought to be enlarged or diminished. No particular congregation, classes, or synod, however, shall be permitted to do this until the national synod shall otherwise order. However, since no national synod was held for 2 centuries, changes could not be made in the Dordt Church Order. So that's why the Dordt Church Order stayed the same for over 200 years. But in practice, the articles of the Church Order that the churches disagreed with or that ceased to be relevant were simply not observed in that period. Now let's specifically look at the influence of the state on the Church Order of Dordt. In the Dutch Republic, church and state were closely interrelated. Not like in America, separation of church and state, that idea wasn't even thought of yet. The Dutch Reformed Church was not, however, a state church, like in some of the Lutheran countries. But since 1580, it was recognized as a privileged church, which enjoyed many of the benefits that were not given to churches that were only tolerated, such as the Roman Catholic or Mennonite churches. The Reformed churches preferred a structure where the church could manage its own affairs, but it also readily took advantage of privileges where they benefited from government support. For example, salaries of ministers. In some cases, the Synod of Dordt made concessions on the role of the state in church affairs, especially on the calling of ministers, the right of patronage, in the hope that the States General would approve the Church Order of Dordt and implement it uniformly throughout the provinces. But, of course, the States General never did grant its approval. The influence of the state on the Dordt Church Order is evident in 15 of its 86 articles. That's quite a bit of influence. And I'll quickly list them here. Article 4, in calling of ministers, we've already touched on this. First time minister was to be chosen by consistory and deacons in consultation with the local Christian government, and after an examination he must receive approval of the government. Article 5, calling of ministers to another church must take place by consistory and deacons, again by consultation with the local government, and must receive approval of the magistrate before being installed. This was to be done without abridging any valid right of patronage, insofar as it is used without detriment to the church. Article 10, ministers must not accept a call elsewhere without consent of the consistory, deacons, and the magistrate. 19, churches should see that there are students of theology supported by public funds. 26, deacons are to consult with poor relief directors that were supported by the government. Article 28, this article describes the office of the Christian magistrate to promote church services, to lend a helping hand to church leaders, and to protect them by their good order, and the obligation of church leaders and congregation to obey, love, and respect the magistrates. Article 37, the local magistrate is allowed to have 1 or 2 representatives at consistory meetings to listen and to deliberate. That's considerable influence in these local churches. Article 49, synodical deputies are to carry out provincial synod decisions relating to the government and to the classes. 50, the church chosen to convene the next national synod, when it deliberates with its classes, is to provide information on the time and place to the States General, which may wish to send deputies to the classes so that the decision may be made with its advice. 64, the practice of evening prayers is not to be removed without the judgment of the government. 66, ministers shall petition the government to designate public days of fasting and prayer in times of need. And 67, ministers are to work with government authorities for conformity in the observance of the religious holidays, day of circumcision and of ascension. 70, the States General, with the advice of ministers, should make a general ordinance so that there may be uniformity in marriage practices. And that varied from province to province. And final, next 71, Christian discipline does not exempt anyone from civil trial and punishment. And finally, 79, when church leaders commit a gross public sin that is publishable by the government, they are to be suspended or deposed. Now, many of these cases, the state influence was present already in the 1586 Church Order of The Hague. I think I've listed them there. However, the Dordt Church Order increased state influence, especially in regard to the calling of ministers, by adding the requirement of consultation with the local magistrate in Articles 4 and 5, and by adding the right of patronage to Article 5. The Dordt Church Order also added new articles on the office of the Christian magistrate in Article 28, and on synodical deputies carrying out decisions that relate to the government. A change was also made in Article 67 requesting the government to bring conformity to religious holidays. Okay, now we look past the Synod of Dordt at the reception of the Church Order of Dordt in the Dutch churches, basically over the next, well, I'm going to focus here just on the next decade or so, but this really continues for the next 200 years in some form. After the Synod of Dordt, the desire for uniformity or unanimity in a church order throughout the Netherlands was not achieved. The States General did not approve of the Church Order of Dordt, since not all provinces approved of it, especially Friesland. Only 3 provinces actually approved the Church Order of Dordt: Utrecht, Overijssel, and Gelderland, but with reservations or minor changes. Now I've got a map here of the Netherlands. You can see where the various provinces are. One thing to notice, Holland at that point is one province, but it has 2 synods, North Holland and South Holland. 2 synods, but 1 provincial body, Holland. And the other thing to notice, Drenthe is not an actual one of the 7 Dutch provinces. It didn't have official status yet. So beyond those, let's look at those 3 then that accepted, I'm back here again, that accepted the Church Order of Dordt. The States of Overijssel in July 1619 accepted the Church Order of Dordt with the proviso that its introduction not conflict with existing privileges and regulations of the province. The States of Utrecht in August of 1619 confirmed the Church Order of Dordt on the condition that in case there was a dispute between the local government and the churches about the interpretation of any article of the church order, the matter was to be determined by the state of Utrecht. And in the states of Gelderland, July 1620, they approved the Dordt church order with 3 small changes to 3 articles. Article 13, or 11, 13, regarding support of ministers, and 41 regarding classes. Now in Friesland, they most strongly objected to the Dordt church order, especially because they wanted to maintain the rights and privileges of local landowners and nobility in the rural areas relating to the selection of ministers, in other words, the right of patronage. Now, the 3 rural districts of Friesland passed a resolution to retain the previous church order, which was modified by the rights and privileges of Friesland. On the other hand, the majority of the towns, which was the 4th district, so you've got 3 rural districts and a district of towns. The towns favored the acceptance of Church Order of Dordt, but they were outvoted, of course, 3-1. The provincial synod of Friesland consented only to what agreed with the former church order of 1586. And by 1622, the majority of clergy in Friesland was advocating for the Dordt church order. But again, the 3 rural districts of the states declared no synodical resolution would have force before being approved by the states. They rejected the Church Order of Dordt and forbade ministers to introduce the Church Order of Dordt on the threat of being disturbers of the peace. Now, the towns did not agree, and they supported the clergy. Later, however, Friesland introduced its own Frisian church order. The states of Zeeland, when they saw that Friesland rejected the approval of the church order, they decided to retain their own Zeeland church order of 1591. States of Holland, again more complicated. They were initially ready to approve the Church Order of Dordt, but when it became clear that the church order would not generally be approved by all provinces, the states of Holland decided in July 1620 to revise it, so revise the Church Order of Dordt. The states made a revision of 17 articles, 17 of the 86 articles, most of which expanded the right of consent by the civil magistrate. Most of the clergy, however, rejected these revisions and favored the acceptance of the Dordt Church Order. In 1624, the South Holland Synod said it would provisionally use the Hague Church Order of 1586. The states, however, didn't approve this. Then in 1626, the South Holland Synod again decided now that even without authorization by the states, it would meanwhile continue to follow the church order of Dordt. So the result was that in the province of Zeeland, no church order was officially authorized. The states wanted to maintain the 1591 Church Order of The Hague, while the churches in practice used the Church Order of Dordt. So it's a complicated situation. Then the states of Groningen, they retained their own church orders. The city adopted the Church Order of 1594, and the surrounding Omelanden retained their own Church Order of 1595. Both of these closely corresponded to the Church Order of Dordt. Finally, the Landskap of Drenthe, which was not a regular province, also retained its own church order, which was the same as the Groningen 1594 church order. But in 1638, a new Drenthe church order was approved by the states there. So that covers how each of the provinces dealt with this issue of accepting the Church Order of Dordt. Before I got into this kind of stuff, I sort of assumed, and I think a lot of people assumed, that after the Synod of Dordt, the Church Order of Dordt was simply followed for the next 200 years until the 19th century. But it's much more complicated. It was not accepted except by 3 provinces, and then in the other provinces, a very complicated situation. Now, since the Union of Utrecht of 1579, Union of Utrecht was the time when the 7 Dutch provinces were united as one republic. Okay, it's the foundation of the Netherlands. Anyway, that Union of Utrecht specified that in matters of religion, these must be the responsibility of the provinces. And the result was that most provinces did not officially adopt the Church Order of Dordt. I mean, that was their excuse. We have the right under the Union of Utrecht to determine our religion, so we have that right. Nobody else is going to force us to take a church order. So the refusal by the provinces to accept the church order mainly had to do with rights of patronage, manorial rights, and governmental rights in the confirmation of ministers. Now, in the view of the state, an independent church would be a danger to the unity of the nation, and any concessions to the state in the Dordt church order did not go far enough. Now, on the other hand, in the view of the church, the state does have a task in relationship to the church, especially indicated by Belgic Confession, Article 36. But the state has no authority within the church. And the concessions that the Dordt Church Order had made had actually gone too far. So that tension was never resolved. Although most of the provinces did not formally approve the Church Order of Dordt, in practice, and that's important, in practice, everywhere in the Netherlands, the churches themselves, in substance, I'm saying that carefully, in substance, followed the Church Order of Dordt because the various provincial church orders shared the essentials of Reformed church polity. In practice, the differences were not that great. So the model of the Church Order of Dordt, containing the main lines of classical Reformed church polity with its church offices and ecclesiastical assemblies, formed the basis for the organization of Reformed church life in the Netherlands for the next 2 centuries. In practice, again, certain stipulations were not observed, especially concessions that had been made to the state. So that's the reception of the Church Order of Dordt. Now let's look at early printings of the Church Order of Dordt. There were 4 early printings which occurred by authorization of those 3 provinces that had approved of the church order. And each of these printings contained all 86 articles. So very quickly, first of all, the Utrecht edition of 1620, apparently the earliest printed edition of the Church Order of Dordt. They approved the church order in August of 1619. And I've got a picture of the printed version there. Second, the Gelderland edition, also of 1620. In 1620, there were 3 printings. So this is one edition, but in Gelderland, they printed it the same edition 3 times. This Gelderland edition, at the end, listed 3 changes that were made by the states of Gelderland to Articles 11, 13, and 41. Article 11 clarifies that the Synod is obliged to provide the minister with suitable support. Article 13 specifies that ministers who can no longer perform their duties due to age or sickness are to be honorably provided for by the churches they have served. And Article 41, in addition, specifies that the classes shall meet twice a year rather than every 3 months, with the consent of the government, unless the need of the churches requires more often. This Gelderland edition, without the 3 changes, is considered to be the most official version of that original Dordt Church Order. Number 3, the Overijssel edition of 1625. In July 1619, the states of Overijssel resolved that the province of Overijssel, in the province, the Dordt Church Order shall be observed insofar as it does not conflict with the privileges and regulations of the province. And then finally, the Walloon edition of 1623. Remember, in the Netherlands, there was a whole population of French-speaking Reformed people who had migrated up from the south, from Catholic countries, and they had their own provincial synod. They had their own representation at the Synod of Dordt. Anyway, they came up with their own translation of the Dordt Church Order, which was intended just for their churches. Conclusion. The essence of Reformed church polity, which was already included in the Belgic Confession, Articles 30 to 32, was embodied in the Acta of the Synod of Emden, 1571, and was further developed in the church orders of the later national synods up until the Synod of Dordt. Although the Dordt church order was not officially or uniformly approved throughout the provinces of the Netherlands, it remained the prototype of Reformed church polity. And in practice, the Dordt church order was followed, at least in its essentials, in most Dutch Reformed churches for the next 2 centuries. But then, of course, in 1816, that all changed. It was supplanted by the general regulations in the Nederlandse Hervormde Kerk, which introduced a centralized bureaucratic church structure with the church simply governed as a department of the state. However, the Dordt church order was taken up again by the churches of the Afscheiding, the 1834 secession, and again by the 1586 Doleantie of Abraham Kuyper. Although revised in various ways, the Church Order of Dordt has for 400 years continued to provide the foundation and structure of church orders of many Reformed church denominations throughout the world, in the Netherlands, North America, South Africa, Asia, Australia, and New Zealand. Finally, a picture of the Synod. Thank you.
The dog is not scratching his head.
Oh, there's no dog there.
He's not scratching his head.
No, he's hiding in the balcony, I think. So, any questions? Yeah.
The 2 different kinds of church orders, the political church orders and the ecclesiastical church
Right.
orders. What was the foundation of the political church orders? Where were they getting their articles from? And I assume, as you went on talking, that the main difference was things like patronage and approval, but
Yeah.
maybe you have other ideas too.
Yeah, well, even the political church orders, the foundation of those was the Reformed church polity as it had developed. So the basics, like the offices, they were unchanged. The different assemblies, the different levels of assembly, that was all maintained. And other basics, like the anti-hierarchical principle, that was maintained. But the political church orders basically wanted to give the state, the local magistrate or the provincial state, more authority in church affairs. They didn't want to have an independent church that caused problems for the state. And they were concerned about maintaining the unity of the Netherlands. So they really didn't like the Arminian controversy, especially. The controversy is going to cause division and stuff. They want to maintain unity. So they want to keep their hands in some control on the churches. And the churches couldn't really go out on their own. I mean, the buildings were really maintained by the state, and the salaries of the ministers, I mean, you've got a lot of power if you control those things. And so the state thought, we have a right to have a say in the selection of ministers and and some of those other things. Yeah. Anyone else?
If I missed this question, or if it's a moot question, but do the non-church churches react in any way positively or negatively to the church order of Dordt?
Yeah.
Not for them.
Right. They rejected it, of course. The remonstrants historically were more in support of the idea that the state has authority over church affairs. So, I mean, that's historically that's an idea that goes way back. So they accepted that idea. Reformed church polity wanted an independent Reformed church, although not totally independent. As I said, there's no idea yet of separation of church and state. That comes later. But at least an independent Reformed church polity where the church can operate on its own within the church, control its own affairs. The remonstrants favored the idea of state influence. So they basically supported the political church orders. So in their churches, they would use, for example, the States of Holland 1591. That was one of the main ones, 1591 state church order. They simply adopted that in their churches because they thought that was a good church order. And once they were kicked out of the synod, and all the leaders, of course, were banished from the country, although in 1625 they were allowed back after Prince Maurice died. They founded their own church denomination, the Brotherhood, the Remonstrant Brotherhood, and they then drew up their own set of regulations, which was more reflected the political church orders. I saw another hand a little while ago. Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Doctor, for the lecture. I'm wondering if the books that are being published that record the sessions when they were discussing the church order at Dordt, were there differences of opinion on certain articles such that those discussions are available in the books?
Most of what I presented here is based on the so-called post-acta sessions, which, by the way, were not included in the government-authorized acta of the synod. I talked about that last week, that they did, the Dutch government basically published the acta for the sake of foreign countries, and they didn't want to have anything that reflected negatively on the Netherlands, or they didn't want to include the nitty-gritty stuff down in the weeds, that goes on in the Dutch churches. So they unilaterally decided all of those post-acta sessions, we're not even going to include them. So they weren't available in published form. In fact, there was a period there where, I think it was 1669, they thought that the post-acta sessions, the acts of those sessions, were lost. And they were looking around, what actually happened in those sessions? And they had a number of people looking around. Well, they found the acts finally in the archives where they were supposed to be. They found them in the Acta Authentica, because these were the official acts produced by the synod, signed by the secretaries and so on, and they are in the back in Latin right here. So that's where they found them. And then, of course, they translated them from this into Dutch, and then they were more publicly available then. Let's see, where was I going here?
Are the discussions available?
Oh yeah, discussions, right. Yeah, so what I presented is really based almost solely on what is in the post-docta sessions. There are no associated materials, or almost no associated materials in diaries and so on, that tell you about discussions. There's only one diary that includes part of those sessions. Sibelius wrote a diary. He was a Dutch minister, but he got sick partway through and went home. So we really don't have access to discussions that took place on the floor of the synod. Now that's very different with the remonstrant Arminian case, where there are 12 diaries by different delegates. You know, they get into the weeds of who's saying what. And the most famous, of course, are the letters of John Hales and Walter Balkenkwal, which have been available in English for 2-3 centuries. You know, they really get into the discussions. But they're foreign. They're foreign people who are observing what's happening at Synod. And of course, the post-docta was only for the Dutch, so the foreign people were gone. So yeah, to your question, I wish we knew more about what actually was discussed. There were some issues, of course, and I highlighted the one, especially issue of patronage, you know, should we support it or not? So we do know, at least on that issue, there was a conflict. We don't know how great that conflict was, but it led to a kind of compromise.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you again for the lecture, Dr. Sinnema.
Mm-hmm.
Mitchell Dick, Sovereign Grace United Reformed Church.
Mm-hmm.
It's a pleasure to meet you.
Mhm.
I have one question. In all of your searching of the history of the Reformed Church order, even prior to Dordt, would you still maintain that Dordt seems to, that wonderful and precious distinctive, that the autonomy of the local church is the key principle distinguishing the Reformed Church order even from Presbyterianism? Or could you expound a little bit on that?
Yeah, that the Presbyterial model is basically the model that the Church Order of Dordt follows, but that goes back right away to the 1571, that very first Synod of Emden. So that idea was really there from the beginning of the Dutch Reformed churches. And at least at the Synod of Dordt, I don't think they saw any difference between the Dutch situation and the, let's say, the Scottish Presbyterian. Some of that may have developed later, but I'm not sure.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Bringing up the Scottish, I was thinking of them too as you were speaking. And that is interesting that the Scottish took up arms over the question of patronage. Made it a matter of the church being spiritual and but the Dutch didn't. Interesting that they sort of just kind of let it fade out.
Oh yeah, eventually, yeah. But the reason they kept it, of course, is that huge impact of the state delegates on the floor of the Synod of Dordt. And of course, as I said last week, the whole Synod of Dordt was called and paid for and supervised by the States General. So it's a bit of a tension And even though, as I indicated, when the advices were given, is this a biblical idea, patronage or not, they uniformly said this is not according to the Word of God, but we're in a situation here where we have to live with this. How can we manage this? So we'll retain the idea, but try to restrict it so that the churches aren't harmed. And that's why there's those 9 rules, which were never, as far as I know, I know they were never accepted by the States General. And even though they were supposed to be included in the published church order, they were never included as an appendix. So how far they were actually implemented, I don't know. But you're correct that, as the situation changed, that sort of medieval structure of patronage sort of faded away, and the problem sort of eventually disappeared, I guess.
Anyone else? All right, thank you again.
And thank you for the invitation to speak to you twice on the Synod of Dordt. So I don't often get invitations about the Synod of Dordt, especially after the 400th anniversary. Everybody wanted people to speak on the Synod of Dordt, but that's passed, and now it's sort of faded into the mist.
We try to do more than remember it historically once in a while, make it live in our churches.
Yeah, good.
We have excised almost all of government influence except in Article 49 in our church order. We
I
still
see.
have the same numbering as Dordt,
Uh-huh.
as a number of other denominations do, but in 49 we still talk about dealing with the government.
Okay. Let me just ask you a question about the Protestant Reformed churches. I know the Christian Reformed Church, 1857, it adopted the Church Order of Dordt, right? And then later in the century, anything relating to the state, the influence of the state, because we're in a very different situation, of course, in North America, anything relating to the state was put in parentheses. It was still there, but put in parentheses. And then in 1905, I think it was, 1914. 1914, the Christian Reformed Church did a revision. So it's still based on the Church Order of Dordt, but made a revision according to the needs of the North American situation. Okay, and then, later again, in 1965, there was another major revision. But now the Protestant Reformed Church, what's your history on that?
What the CRC had in 1924, we carried that with
So the 1914 version, yeah,
basically.
and kept that.
Since then, we've revised it, not substantially, but some significant changes.
So just along the way, there was no significant revision of the.
Well, in year 2000, we made it pretty comprehensive.
Okay.
All the
Okay.
numbers are the same.
Oh, still 86
Yeah.
articles? Yeah.
So when Russ Baxter and I went to South Africa 15 years ago, we had talked to those folks down there about what article, we all
Yeah.
knew what the other was talking about.
Yeah.
And our Article 49 is in parentheses.
Oh, in parentheses. Is that true? Oh, I see. Okay. Okay. Well, thanks for the answer.
All right.